Last week we started this series, Overflow. We're looking at revisiting our Overflow vision that we looked at back in 2019. We cast a vision back then to be a church overflowing with joy and generosity and God's presence. And we really feel like we're walking into that increasingly over the years ahead. We looked at the example of the Macedonian churches last week, where Paul is writing to the church in Corinth and encouraging them to be generous. They're a well-resourced church, and Paul uses the example of the Macedonian churches who are less well-resourced. They're poor churches, they're in poverty, they're also in persecution, but they well up and overflow with joy and generosity. And even in the midst of what Paul describes as a very severe trial. And if you missed that talk, as always, you can catch up on our YouTube channel. And it's worth doing because we had two excellent testimonies last week. We had Rebecca Swansbury gave a testimony and Richard Miller gave a testimony about why they choose to overflow with generosity in their own lives and in their own families. So that's worth catching up with. So last week we began to explore this principle of in the kingdom we're called to cascade, we're called to pass on, we're called to overflow with what God has freely given us. And we talked about increasing our standard of giving rather than our standard of living, and trying to think about when God blesses us and increases our abundance, rather than kind of accumulating things, how do we cascade that and pass it on? And I want to continue that theme today. Let's look at Luke's Gospel. We're going to go from chapter 12 in Luke's Gospel. I'm going to read from verse 1. It says, "Meanwhile, when a crowd of many thousands had gathered, so they were trampling on each other." So imagine the picture, all these people pressing in, trying to get close to Jesus, trying to listen to what Jesus says. And Luke says that they're up to thousands now. Jesus began to speak, but he doesn't speak to them first. First of all, he speaks to his disciples. He has a conversation with his disciples rather than addressing the crowd that's gathered. And he says, "Be on your guard against the yeast of the Pharisees, which is hypocrisy. There is nothing concealed that will not be disclosed, or hidden that will not be made known. What you have said in the dark will be heard in the daylight, and what you have whispered in the ear in the inner room will be proclaimed from the roofs." So even though there's huge crowds there, Jesus begins by talking to his disciples about some key principles about the kingdom. And he warns them about hypocrisy, which he says is the yeast of the Pharisees. Now in Jesus' time, in ancient Greek theatres, actors would often wear masks, quite scary masks like this one. And they would hide behind the mask. Their identity would be hidden, and they would be known as the hypocrites. They were the hidden ones. They were speaking from behind the mask. And so this Greek word that we now know, hypocrite, means to basically pretend to be one thing, but actually be something else, to wear a figurative mask. And Jesus is saying that's how he views the Pharisees. They are presenting as one thing, but in reality they are something else. And the masks the Pharisees wore was they purported to represent God's best and God's heart and God's love, but actually they had very different motives behind the mask. And this is what he describes as their yeast, the thing that's been spread, because yeast is used as a metaphor for something that kind of spreads through people and culture. And these are important themes because Jesus returns to these later on as he continues to address the crowd. But then suddenly the conversation gets switched from the disciples to the wider audience. Someone shouts out from the crowd, "Teacher, tell my brother to divide the inheritance with me." So someone wants Jesus to give him justice. So Jesus, seen by many people as a rabbi, as a wise person, as a teacher, and this person wants Jesus to declare publicly that his brother should split the inheritance with him. It's in an unresolved situation in the family. And Jesus replies, says these words, "Man, who appointed me a judge or an arbiter between you?" And then he stops and says, "Watch out. Be on your guard against all kinds of greed. Life does not consist in an abundance of possessions." And then he told them this parable. We're going to pause there. So the man's looking for Jesus to be what the Bible describes as an arbiter, someone who'll bring justice into a situation, someone who'll divide things fairly. But Jesus refuses to be drawn into that conversation, refuses to be drawn into that man's situation. Instead, he sees an opportunity for a teaching moment. And he warns the crowd, watch out. So he's speaking now to thousands of people. Watch out, be on your guard against all kinds of greed. Why? Well, Jesus says because life, real life, doesn't consist in how much stuff you accumulate. Real life does not consist in the abundance of possessions. And he goes on to tell them a parable to reinforce this principle. He tells them this parable. He says this: the ground of a certain rich man yielded an abundant harvest. He thought to himself, what shall I do? I have no place to store my crops. Then he said, this is what I'll do. I'll tear down my barns and I'll build bigger ones, and there I will store my surplus grain. And I say to myself, you have plenty of grain laid up for many years. Take life easy, eat, drink, and be merry. But God said to him, you fool, this very night your life will be demanded from you. Then who will get what you've prepared for yourself? Then Jesus closes by saying, this is how it will be with whoever stores up things for themselves, but not is rich towards God. So it's quite a hard-hitting parable from Jesus addressing these thousands gathered in front of him. And Jesus has been speaking previously about what we call theologically as eschatological terms, themes about when it all comes to an end, when God wraps it all up. Jesus has been speaking before, you can see that at the top of Luke 12, about what happens when God kind of calls time on everything. And into that context, Jesus says, be aware that your life really isn't about accumulating stuff. It really isn't about gathering wealth. It really isn't about what we said last week, who dies with the most toys wins. That's not what real life is really about. Because what he's doing now, he's putting the value of money and possessions into an eternal context. He's saying, where do they sit in an eternal context? And Jesus has already warned the crowd against covetousness, which is a strong desire for stuff, a strong desire for material possessions. And referring to the 10th commandment, which says, don't covet your neighbour's house, don't covet your neighbour's wife or their servants or their ox or their donkey. Don't basically lust after anything that your neighbour has. Don't want what they've got. Don't want all their stuff. And the commandment, interestingly, shows that God doesn't promise parity in this life. He doesn't say we'll all get the same amount of stuff. God doesn't promise parity. Jesus doesn't promise parity. But what Jesus says, whatever you have, however much stuff you have, live a life of generosity with what God has given you, with what is in your hand. To covet is to desire more than what God has given us. Is to continually want more, to need more, to have more. We said last week, didn't we, that some of us have large cups and some of us have smaller cups. But we don't live with parity in our community. Some of us have lots of stuff, some of us have less stuff, some of us have very little stuff. We have different size cups. God doesn't promise we'll all have the same amount of stuff. But Jesus says, regardless of how big your cup is, life doesn't really exist in the abundance of possession. That real life isn't found in the stuff that we accumulate. The value of your life is more to do with what you do with your stuff, what you do with God entrusts to you. And the language that Jesus uses here is, are you being rich towards God with the stuff that God has given you? So the man in the crowd is looking for parity. Jesus, tell my brother to divide equally our inheritance. But Jesus doesn't point to parity. Jesus points instead to generosity. And that's where the Bible leads us when we think about possessions. So in this parable, there's a rich man, and his land has yielded an abundant harvest. This man is overflowing with abundance, with fruitfulness. And he's faced with the question, what do I do with what God is giving to me? And every follower of Jesus is called to be fruitful. Every follower of Jesus is called to be abundant, overflowing with what God pours into their life. He says in John 15, this is to my Father's glory that you bear much fruit, showing yourself to be my disciples. So following Jesus results in fruitfulness in all sorts of different ways. And then Jesus says, what are you going to do with the abundance that I'm putting into your hand? So the man in the story is faced with the question, what does he do with the stuff that's coming into his hands? What's he do with the abundant harvest that's being gathered from his lands? What shall I do with the fruit? The man's got a number of choices. Does he keep it or does he release it? Does he stockpile it or does he scatter it? Does he get a bigger cup or does he cascade with generosity? These are the things the man is facing. He is stressing because he hasn't got enough room for his stuff. I've got no room to store my fruits. His abundance was creating anxiety rather than generosity. I don't know about you, but you might find as you accumulate more stuff, you get anxious about it. If you ever had a new car, the first few weeks, you're terrified that someone's going to bang the car, scratch the car, tap the car, it just comes with anxiety, doesn't it? If you had a new car, you've been there. And after a few weeks and months, and the car gets a bit tatty and a bit knocked about, some of the anxiety goes away, because actually you realise in reality, it's just a car. But stuff brings anxiety. And the truth is that stuff has got gravity. The more stuff we accumulate, the more gravity this has, the more pull it has on our lives. The more we amass, the more gravity of possessions comes into play. And it gets stronger and stronger the more we accumulate. The man in the story is already rich. He's getting richer. And with that richness is coming increasing anxiety. And you can see it in culture. Some of the richest men on the planet are some of the most anxious men on the planet. You can see it in culture all around us. People haven't got enough room for their stuff. Let's watch a quick clip from comedian George Carlin, who does a fantastic job on describing this.
Got to have a little place to put your stuff during the day, during the evening, whatever it is, don't you? Sure. Everybody's got to have a little place for their stuff. That's all life is about. That's the meaning of life. Trying to find a place to keep your stuff. That's all your house is. Think of it. That's all your house is. It's a place to keep your stuff. If you didn't have so much stuff, you wouldn't need a house. You could just walk around all the time. That's all your house is. It's a pile of stuff with a cover on it. That's all your house is. It's a place to keep your stuff while you go out and get more stuff. Sometimes you gotta move. Sometimes you gotta move. You gotta get a bigger house. Why? Too much stuff. Now, sometimes you go on vacation. You gotta bring some of your stuff with you. Can't take all your stuff. Just the stuff you really like. The stuff that fits you good that month. You gotta take a smaller version of your stuff. Say you're gonna go to Honolulu for 2 weeks. 2 weeks in Honolulu, you gotta take 2 big bags of stuff. You get to Honolulu, you fly halfway across an ocean. You get to Honolulu, get in a hotel room, and you put away your stuff. That's the first thing you do in a hotel room is put away your stuff. Hey, I'll put some stuff here, I'll put some stuff there. You put your stuff over there, I'll put my stuff over here. Here's another place, you put some stuff here. Here's another place over here. Hey, we got more places than we got stuff. We're gonna have to buy more stuff.
Brilliant observational humour there by George. Life and stuff. If life just consists in amassing more and more stuff, then the more stuff we amass, the more the gravity of that stuff exerts its pull upon us, the more anxiety we have in looking after our stuff. And we find ourselves in orbit around our money and possessions rather than in orbit around God, who seeks to be the centre of our lives. And we find that we're centering ourselves on our stuff and our possessions rather than centering on God. And that's why Jesus says, watch out. In the strongest terms, be on your guard, because actually stuff has gravity. But real life doesn't consist in it. Real life isn't to be found in it. When we are rich towards God, we break the gravity of stuff. We break the gravity of materialism. We recenter our lives around the purposes of God. So rather than being held in orbit around our stuff, we orbit around the purposes of God. We orbit around Jesus. And stuff then becomes a tool in our hands that we can use to be generous towards God and people and the kingdom. Some of the happiest people on earth of people who've managed to break the grip of materialism, who managed to get the priorities right in life. I've met people who've done that who are rich, and I've met people who still orbit around their stuff with all the anxiety that comes with it. So every time we're generous, we're basically aligning ourselves with kingdom culture, and we're breaking that gravity of materialism that is getting more and more endemic in our culture. Now, George wrote that sketch back in 1984. How much more is materialism prevalent now in 2025? But he was spot on back in 1984, but how much more exaggerated now in 2025? Back in this parable, the rich man isn't thinking about how he can give away his stuff. He's thinking about how he can solve his storage problem. He wants to stockpile it. What can I do? How can I store it? He believes that what's in his hands is purely his and only his. But in reality, he's just a steward. We said this before. We just actually steward what God puts in our hands. It's never really ours. It's just passing through in the lifetime while we have it. And again, people who understand that are some of the most open-handed and generous people that I know. When they understand actually it's just passing through their hands. They're just stewarding that stuff for a while. The prophet Hosea, he rebukes the nation of Israel by saying this: she has not acknowledged that I was the one who gave her the grain. I was the one who gave her the new wine, the oil. I was the one who lavished the silver and gold on her. And so the prophet is rebuking the people on God's behalf to say, you've lost connection with the source of your supply, with your abundance. It all ultimately comes from God. It all ultimately returns to God. It just passes through our hands. We can't take it into eternity in that way. And when we separate the gift from the giver, then Jesus says you're on unstable ground. You need to watch out and be on your guard, because if you separate yourself from the giver, then you become the center of your own universe. You orbit around your stuff, and pride breaks in, and you start saying things like, this is what I'll do. This is what I'm going to do with my stuff. These are the choices I'm going to make with my stuff. And we center our universe upon ourselves. When we do that, we isolate ourselves from the one who provides. Jesus' brother James, he warns against this in his letter to the churches. He writes these words: now listen, you who say today or tomorrow we'll go to this or that city and spend a year there, or carry on our business and make money. Why do you not even know what will happen tomorrow? What is your life? You're a mist that appears for a little while and then vanishes. Instead, you ought to say, if it is the Lord's will, we will live and do this or that. As it is, you boast in your arrogant schemes. All such boasting is evil. If anyone then who knows the good they ought to do and doesn't do it, it's a sin for them. So there's two things going on here. James is saying, essentially, live humbly. Live in sight of the one who really is in charge of the universe. Live in a way that recognizes he's the one who's over all things, and submit and listen and respond to him. Don't somehow think you can stand aside and say, I'm going to do this and I'm going to do that in isolation from God. And also, we have what's called a sin of omission. Most sins are sins of commission. You choose to do something and it's something that maybe God wouldn't be happy with. This is a sin of omission. If you know what you should do, but you don't do it, then essentially, again, you're doing something in a way that kind of offends the heart of God. And if you're generous and you're responding to God's leading, but if you have stuff, if you're stockpiling stuff and you know you need to be generous, but actually for whatever reason you're choosing not to, well, James says that's sin. That's basically missing the heart of God. And so we're called to partner with God's heart. We're called to partner with God's desires. Our responses should be, rather than, oh, I'm going to do this and I'm going to do that, it's like, God, what would you want me to do? How would you want me to respond? What do you want me to do? Ephesians 9:5, Paul writes, find out what pleases the Lord. Try and get in step with the Spirit. Try and figure out what God is doing in your life and wanting you to respond. The man in this story has got perfectly good barns, but they aren't big enough for what God is providing for him. So he says, rather than overflow, the best thing I can do is rip down these perfectly good barns and build some bigger ones. We've known people who've taken out perfectly good bathrooms and put in brand new ones just because they had a surplus of money. So let's rip out a bathroom and put in a brand new bathroom simply because I'll need something to spend my money on. So this guy says, I'll say to myself, I'll build these bigger barns. And when the man says, hey, I'll say to myself, literally it says, I'll speak to my soul. I'll be the master of my soul. You'll have plenty of grain laid up for many years. Take life easy, eat, drink, and be merry. Who has become the center in this story? Who has become the source in this story? Well, clearly not God. The man believes all this has come by his own hand. All this has come by his own desires. He's the master of his destiny. He's the master of his domain. He's going to sit back on his stockpile and he's going to eat, drink, and be merry. But Jesus declares him a fool. Now, in the Greek, that word means mindless, ignorant, egotistic, and unbelieving. Okay? So this man is a fool. And he tells him that his soul, which interestingly is the same word that's used here as myself. So basically there's a play on words here which we don't pick up, but the word that Jesus uses for the man is also the word that's used for soul, will be demanded from him. Even though the rich man thinks he has everything and control of everything, he discovers that he doesn't even own himself. He doesn't even own his soul. That doesn't belong to him, but to God, and that God will demand that back from him. And then Jesus says, essentially, what's going to happen to all that stuff? What's going to happen to all that stuff? The day of reckoning has come for the man. And this has got echoes of the eternal that Jesus has already been speaking to previously in Luke 12. These end time things, when God calls time. So Jesus is putting this man's story in the perspective of eternity. He's speaking of the day when everything will be drawn together, when God calls time. And nothing is hidden, and everything is made known. When what's said in the dark will be heard in the daylight, what's whispered in inner rooms will be said from the rooftops. A day when the masks simply won't work anymore. The yeast of the Pharisees will no longer be present because everything will come into the light. And a day when the rich will be asked to give an account for what they did with the stuff that God put into their hands. How did they steward it? So while the man lies back, relaxing in his abundance, God calls time. And Jesus says, then who will get what you've prepared for yourself? Your abundance is no use to you now because in the light of eternity, it has no value. And Jesus finishes by saying these powerful words. This is how it will be with whoever stores up things themselves but is not rich towards God. So the whole purpose of this parable is to say, guys, live with a heavenly perspective when you think about your stuff. When you think about your money and your possessions, live with a heavenly perspective. We can store up treasure on earth, or we can store up treasure in heaven. A guy called Randy Alcorn, who wrote a book called The Treasure Principle, puts it this way. He says, Jesus takes the profound truth, you can't take it with you, and adds a stunning qualification. By telling us to store up treasure for ourselves in heaven, he gives us the breathtaking proposition, you can't take it with you, but you can send it on ahead. Anything we try to hang on to here will be lost, but anything we put into God's hands will be ours for eternity. If we give instead of keep, if we invest in the eternal instead of the temporal, we store up treasures in heaven that will never stop paying dividends. Whatever treasure we store up on earth will be left behind when we leave. Whatever treasures we store up in heaven will be waiting for us when we arrive. And he does a little video. Let's watch this.
Jesus says, do not store up for yourselves treasures on earth, where moth and rust destroy and where thieves break in and steal. Why is he telling them don't store up for yourselves treasures on earth? Because they're not going to last. It's not simply that it's the wrong thing to do. It's the stupid thing to do. But Jesus says, turn it around. Store up for yourselves treasures in heaven. Then if you know me, you're going to heaven. Then every day of your life, if your treasures are in heaven, you're getting closer to your treasures instead of moving away from your treasures. He who spends his life moving away from his treasures has reason to despair. He who spends his life moving toward his treasures has reason to rejoice. This life is just a dot. And from that dot extends a line, and that line is going to go out forever. We all live in the dot, but if we're smart, we're not going to live for the dot. We're going to live for the line with the people of God. God who will live forever, people who will live forever, his word which will live forever. So live your life now while you're in the dot, in light of the line, investing in the line. What's going to matter after you die?
So very powerful symbolism there from Randy, just describing the dot and the line. The analogy between the two, the short life that we have on earth and then the eternity we have to spend with God. And where are we choosing to invest? Where are we choosing to invest? He said a short-sighted person invests in the dot, but a person with a heavenly perspective is thinking about the line, is thinking about, and that's why Jesus says, don't store up your treasures here. Because essentially, that's not a great place to store them up, because essentially, they're going to pass away. But if you live with a heavenly perspective, if you live in a way that's rich towards God and people, then you're investing in eternity. And we don't know what our treasures will look like in heaven. We don't know what heaven looks like. We don't know what eternity looks like. But we need to listen to the words of Jesus, who gives us wisdom and says, live with a perspective that is bigger than just the now, just bigger than just the dot of the life that we live in today. And that's essentially the story and the message behind that rich man and the barns parable that Jesus tells. The man's amassing treasure for himself in the dot. But actually that's a very temporal thing to do, a very short-sighted thing to do. Jesus says our generosity has direction. If we're living with eternal perspective, then our generosity has direction, because we're conscious that God is building something of eternal value. And when we invest in that, we invest in the kingdom, then our treasures go on into eternity. And we recognize once again, he's the source of our abundance. He's the source of our ability to be generous. So during this series, I've asked people to come and contribute and tell a bit of their story, and I've asked them some questions. Here they are. What made you decide to start giving regularly and generously to church? How has this decision affected your life? What have been some of the challenges about this? And what wisdom or advice would you give us today? And I'm going to start by inviting Darlene to come and share her story. Let's welcome Darlene. So first question then, what made you decide to start giving generously?
Okay, so I was brought up in a family where we were encouraged from a very young age as children to put aside a little bit every month, even from our pocket money, towards church. So I think that's where it started, even though I didn't understand it, that's just what you did. Okay.
And how has that decision affected the rest of your life as you move forward?
So that has continued, although I would say that I didn't necessarily connect giving with generosity until I would say later in my life. I knew it was the right thing to do to give. I always knew that actually for me, if you're following Jesus, it's about being all in. And that means everything, money, time, your whole attitude. It's not a choice of, I'll leave that bit to the side, actually. It was about being all in. So I can't remember the question now. So that was always the right thing to do. If I'm honest, I probably gave out of guilt at some point in my life, because I thought if I don't give, God might strike me down. I know it sounds ridiculous, doesn't it? But actually, if you understood the context of my upbringing in the Christian world, that was very much, I don't want to dare go against what I knew was right. So that has continued. I'm going to carry on, is that all right?
Yeah, you carry on. You carry on.
I think, the more I've gone on in my life, the more I want to be all in with Jesus. And that's not to say there haven't been challenges. Mark and I faced real financial challenge when we were first married. I had, as you know, twin girls, which meant I couldn't work. So we were living off one salary, which years ago, I know that that's what a lot of families did. But in this day and age, it's quite hard to live off of one salary. So, we literally were faced with enough money in the purse and going shopping. You had to decide what you did and didn't need. In some ways, they were really joyful times because we learnt to trust God more. So actually, it was about being thankful and really trusting God, believing that He completely had us. And we knew that he wouldn't fail us or let us down. So that sort of led into that challenges, isn't it?
Yeah.
Just making sure I've not written anything really important in here that I'm going to miss. I think as well, for me, it was almost a non-negotiable of being a Christian. It's like, well, why wouldn't you want to be part of something bigger? And I think it was really interesting what Richard said last week, something I hadn't even considered, and that was like standing orders or direct debits. When you give that way, you're not making a conscious decision to give. It's just something you've decided to do, but you don't necessarily think about it. It just happens. And I think that challenged me to think again and pray again about, what am I giving to? Is this the right amount? Do I need to review that? Because it's very easy just to sort of let it carry on. And wisdom or advice I'd give, I would say just start doing it. I think Rebecca said that. I'm so glad that I had that instilled in me from a very young age, the importance of giving, because it's just carried on. I think you learn to look at the bigger picture if you give. It's not all self-centred. It's about giving back to God what he's given me, and he's given me life through Jesus, and I'm so grateful for that. And actually, I want to be part of this kingdom thing that we're all doing together.
Thank you, darling. Okay, now Kelly's going to come and share. Let's welcome Kelly.
So when Simon first asked me if I'd like to contribute as part of this series, I thought he was reaching out to the wrong person, because his email said he was looking for people who give regularly and generously. And I do give regularly, but I wouldn't consider it to be overly generous. But then I thought about it and thought, actually, generous is a relative term, and I guess that's kind of the point that we get to hear from different people. So I thought, okay, I'll do it. But then this secondary feeling came up, and it was just a really icky feeling. I thought, do I really want to stand up in front of everyone in church and speak about money? Of all things Simon could have asked me to speak about, why money? It's just awkward, isn't it? And especially when you speak about giving to church. When the welcome baskets used to come round, I would say like, oh, no, thank you, or just quietly pass it on to the next person. I'd feel this weird sense that I'd want to say to people, I give online. And I don't know why, it just makes people go weird, doesn't it? But I thought, God's given me this opportunity. I did actually used to work in charity fundraising, and that's what I was doing when the pandemic happened. So I've seen firsthand how important regular giving is in order to plan for the future. So I thought, right, God's given you this opportunity. You're just going to have to get over yourself and just do it. So my story when it comes to giving is I was sat here in a service not so dissimilar to this, where we were speaking about giving and the importance of, overflowing and being generous. And I just wasn't giving. I was a few months into my journey with Riverside, and there was no reason why I wasn't giving. I just hadn't really got round to it. I'm the kind of person that if I want to do something, I have to do it there and then. So when Keely says it's tuna week or it's biscuits week, I have to go straight from here to Sainsbury's to get what I need and put it on the side for next Sunday, because otherwise I just won't do it. And it's not that I don't want to, I just forget. Like if I go shopping on a Wednesday, life has happened, other things are at the top of my mind, and it just doesn't happen. So while I was sat here on the Sunday, it was like God had said to me, there's nothing else on your plate right now. You are sat here listening to it. Just do it now. So I did. I just got my phone out in the middle of the service, so maybe I shouldn't admit to that, but I got my phone out, went on the Riverside website, clicked on the giving bit at the top, and the bank details were there, so I just set it up there and then. So if anyone wants to do that, I won't be offended if you'd rather do that than listen to me. And then the question came about of how much should I give? And then a number popped into my head, and it felt like it came from nowhere. And I know now that when that happens, it's never come from nowhere. It's usually God. And I knew it wasn't me, because that's not the number I wanted to give. And I listened to the number, and I thought, oh, that's a bit higher than I thought. But okay, then I knew then it had to be God. It wasn't me. So I set it up. And then Simon was asking, have there been any challenges since? And yes, there have. I have absolutely questioned it since. So since I've been coming to Riverside, my work situation has changed drastically and dramatically, pretty much overnight, twice. And during those times, it was quite a difficult time. I had a period of maybe 3 or 4 months where I literally didn't have enough money coming in to pay my rent and bills. And when you live on your own and it's a single income, having to pay for everything, it's a really, really tough situation to be in. And I'd be lying if I hadn't considered my giving to Riverside. So as a responsible adult would, I looked through everything I was paying for, and I looked through, the stuff you can't cancel, so your gas and your electric and stuff like that. Then I was looking at the optional stuff, so my Netflix and the YouTube Premium and things like that. And right at the top was Riverside. And I looked at it, and I thought, no, don't touch it. Then I looked at it again and again and again, and I hovered over the cancel button, but I didn't cancel it. And then I thought about, why did I not cancel it? And I think there's two main reasons why I have left it there. And the first one is faith. So this is just my personal feeling about it, and I'm not saying anyone else should feel the same way. But for me, I felt like if I was cancelling it, what I was saying to God was, I can't afford it right now, and I also can't foresee any way that I'm going to be able to afford it in the near future. And to me, that felt like I was saying to God, I don't trust you. Whereas if I kept it there and held out and prayed on it, I felt like what I was saying was, I can't afford it right now, but I trust you to provide a way so that I can pay my rent and bills, and that you will enable me to then give to others, because you know how important it is to me to give to others. So that's what I did. I held out and I prayed, and in both of those situations, I got offered a job completely from nowhere. Again, this is from nowhere, from God, with no interview process, nothing. God really did provide. And then Keely asked me when I wrote this a couple of weeks ago, has my faith grown, and how's the decision affected my life and my faith? And at the time I thought, I'm not really sure. But then since then, as always, God says, I'll show you. So in this couple of weeks in between, I actually got an unexpected letter that was going to push my outgoings beyond what was actually manageable. And I'm still recovering from that financial situation that happened before. I've never missed a bill, thanks God. But I am still recovering from that. So when this letter came, it did hurt. I'm only human, I had a bit of a cry, and I was trying to think of the situations and how I was going to fix it. But this time, I didn't consider touching the Riverside outgoing. Even when somebody else said to me, you do know if you cancelled that, you could pay for that, I said, no, I'm not doing it. And a word that Simon said last week really stuck with me, and it's integrity. So for me, it was that integrity, and I loved that video of the dot on the line, because I feel like for me, my values and my morals, it feels important to me to give to others, and it would feel selfish of me to stop giving to others because I'm worrying about myself. So I kept it, and then I'm still praying on it, still don't know what the full solution is going to be, but even this morning I've had a conversation with someone, and I can see the potential then of the hope of a potential resolution. Then the second reason I didn't cancel it was a value exchange. So when I was going through looking at what to keep, what to cancel, I was looking at what value does it bring to my life, and what do I pay for it? So like Netflix, for example, I don't watch it that often. Do I really need to pay for it? Probably not. So that went. Some things I kept, and I'm sure other people would look at what I kept and think, well, that's a really strange thing to keep if you're really struggling with money, because I kept Disney Plus. But this is where the value thing is really personal, because I got rid of Netflix so I don't use it, but Disney Plus is where all my comfort shows are. And for me, because I'm autistic, I don't like watching new things. So when I've had a hard day or I'm struggling, I like to put something on that I've watched 100 times, because I know what's coming and it's expected, and it relaxes me and it calms me and it brings me joy. So for me, what I pay for Disney Plus is worth it. So I kept it. So then I did this same kind of value exchange thing with Riverside. And if you haven't done it, I would invite you to do it, because it's actually really fun to look at what you get for your money. So for me, I looked at what I was giving to Riverside, and I looked at what I get out of Riverside. Now I come here pretty much every single week. I get to see all you amazing people. There's free tea, there's free coffee, there's ongoing education. I get to listen to this and push my thoughts. I can then go out and chat to people about it. Like Simon said, if you miss it, you can watch it on YouTube, you can listen to it on podcasts, you can ask questions. If there's anything I don't understand, I can ask Simon. Steve does his series, and I know that we're potentially doing an evening where we can ask him questions. Where do you get that in education anywhere else? It's just constantly ongoing. I get access to social events. So I was at Pride yesterday. We've got this, event coming on Friday. Feels like I'm part of like an exclusive membership network. They talk about the 6 degrees of separation. I think here it's 1 to 2. There's always something. If you need something, you only need to ask 1 or 2 people in church. Somebody somewhere will be able to help you, and you can help them. I feel like an exclusive member when I come to the cafe. It's a great place to come and work because you feel like you know everyone. I go to life group twice a month, and I don't know what other life groups are like, but ours is a little bit like group therapy. And what I pay monthly for what I give to Riverside is really, really cheap for group therapy. And that doesn't even consider the friendships that I've got from here, which are literally priceless. You could not put a price on it. So when I look at what I give to Riverside and the value I get from it, it then really is a no-brainer. So when Simon was asking what wisdom or advice would I give, Simon said, this is why I've asked you to speak, because I always look at things a different way. So I wouldn't stand here and say to you, I think you should give, or I think you should give this amount. But what I would say to you is, if you are questioning how much to give or whether to give, I would look at how much value do you feel from Riverside. And if you feel the value, the giving is just a secondary thing. So for me, Riverside gives so much value to the community. And if you don't feel that, then I would be questioning, have you been into Grow Baby? Have you seen what they're doing? Have you spoken to Abby and seen what they're doing with the youth? Have you been to the youth hub? Have you been to see what's on the shelves in pantry? Have you volunteered? We've heard this morning just all these different opportunities. If you're not seeing or feeling the value that Riverside gives the community, I would question, are you immersing yourself enough? If you don't feel the value that Riverside brings to you personally, then I would question, what happens after the service? Do you run away? Like I sometimes do. Or do you go and have a coffee and connect with people? Are you part of a life group? Are you really pushing yourself and growing and rewatching the services? So that's the question I would say, is if you're thinking about giving or how much to give, don't look at the value that side, but look at how much value you're getting out of Riverside. Because when you really do feel that value, then the giving becomes a secondary no-brainer.
Thank you. That's why I put Kelly on last. So, if you ever want to stand, we've gone over time. Thank you guys so much. Thank you, darling. Thank you, Kelly, for just contributing to this series. In summary, guys, God doesn't want us to build bigger barns. He wants us to build bigger hearts. That's the essence of what the gospel is all about, having our hearts stretched, having our capacity stretched, overflowing with generosity. So I just want to pray to conclude today. Lord, we thank you for your presence. We thank you for being with us so beautifully in worship and in conversation and through your word. And Lord, we just pray once again that it be your voice that we hear. It be your voice that leads us. It be your voice that's leading us into eternity. We thank you that you are so present in our life in so many ways. I pray no one would leave here feeling guilty or under obligation. God, I thank you that everyone gives so generously in so many different ways. Some have a lot, some have a little. God, just help us to be wise stewards and to listen to your words and take your wisdom into our lives and to trust you and to see what happens when we partner with you. And we ask that in Jesus' name. Amen.